The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the dusty general store in Redemption, Wyoming territory, and Clara Bennett stepped down onto the wooden boardwalk wearing men's trousers, a cotton shirt, and boots that had seen better days. Her copper hair braided down her back in a practical plait that swung like a rope as she surveyed the town that would become her new home in the summer of 1878. She had traveled nearly 2,000 miles from Philadelphia to marry a rancher named Thomas Garrett, a man she had never met but whose letters over the past 6 months had been kind and thoughtful, filled with descriptions of his cattle ranch and the wide open spaces of Wyoming. Clara had answered an advertisement for a mail-order bride not because she was desperate or because she had no other options, but because the confines of Philadelphia society had been suffocating her since she was old enough to understand that women were expected to wear corsets so tight they could barely breathe, to speak only when spoken to, and to never, ever express an opinion that might contradict a man. Her parents had died of influenza 2 years ago, leaving her in the care of an aunt who believed that Clara's independent spirit needed to be broken like a wild horse, and the advertisement for a Western bride had seemed like a doorway to freedom. The driver handed down her trunk, which contained everything she owned in the world, and Clara paid him with coins from her reticule before looking around the main street of Redemption. It was smaller than she had expected, with perhaps 24 buildings lining the dirt road, but there was something honest about it, something real. Men in dusty chaps and wide-brimmed hats walked past, tipping their heads politely, and a few women in calico dresses gave her curious looks. Clara supposed she must make quite a sight in her unconventional clothing, but she had grown tired of skirts that dragged in the dirt and petticoats that weighed as much as a small child. Miss Bennett. A deep voice spoke behind her, and Clara turned to see a tall man with dark hair and gray eyes standing a few feet away, holding his hat in his hands. He was perhaps 30 years old, with sun-weathered skin and the lean build of someone who worked hard every day. He wore clean denim pants, a blue cotton shirt, and a leather vest, and there was something gentle in his expression despite the strong line of his jaw. "Yes," Clara said, meeting his gaze directly. "You must be Thomas Garrett." "I am," he said, and a smile touched his lips. "It is good to finally meet you in person. Your letters were wonderful to read during the long winter months." "Yours as well," Clara said honestly. Thomas had written about his ranch, about the challenges of raising cattle in Wyoming, about his dreams of building something lasting. He had never once suggested that Clara should be anything other than herself, which was more than most men of her acquaintance had ever offered. Thomas's gaze traveled over her clothing, and Clara lifted her chin, prepared for criticism or disappointment. Instead, he said, "I hope the journey was not too difficult. I know it is a long way from Philadelphia." "It was an adventure," Clara said, relaxing slightly. "I am not afraid of hard travel." "I can see that," Thomas said, and there was approval in his voice. He picked up her trunk as though it weighed nothing at all. "My wagon is just down the street. The ranch is about an hour's ride from town. I thought we might stop at the hotel for some lunch first, if you are hungry, and then we can discuss the arrangements for the wedding." Clara followed him to a sturdy wagon hitched to 2 horses, and Thomas lifted her trunk into the back with easy strength before offering his hand to help her up onto the seat. His palm was calloused and warm, and Clara felt a flutter of something in her chest that might have been nervousness or anticipation or both. They drove to the hotel, a 2-story building with a restaurant on the first floor, and Thomas helped her down before leading her inside. The dining room was modest but clean, with checkered tablecloths and the smell of beef stew in the air. Thomas ordered for both of them, and when the food arrived, Clara ate with genuine appetite, having subsisted on jerky and hard biscuits for much of the journey. Thomas watched her with quiet amusement, and Clara realized that he was not the sort of man who expected a woman to pick at her food like a bird. "I should tell you," Clara said, setting down her fork and meeting his eyes, "that I am not the sort of woman who fits easily into conventional expectations. I wrote honestly in my letters, but I want to make certain you understand what you are getting before we proceed with any wedding plans." Thomas leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "What is it you want me to understand?" "I do not wear corsets," Clara said bluntly. "I prefer practical clothing to fashionable gowns. I speak my mind. I have opinions about politics and business and all manner of things that women are not supposed to discuss. I can ride a horse and shoot a rifle, and I have no interest in spending my days sitting in a parlor doing needlework. If you want a delicate, obedient wife who will defer to your judgment in all things, then I am not that woman, and it would be better for both of us if I took the next stage back to Philadelphia." She held her breath, waiting for Thomas to withdraw his offer, to tell her that he had made a mistake. Instead, he smiled, a slow, genuine smile that transformed his face. "Miss Bennett, if I had wanted a delicate, obedient wife, I would have married one of the women in Redemption years ago. I wrote to you because your letters showed spirit and intelligence and a willingness to build a life in a place that can be harsh and unforgiving. Wyoming needs strong women, not fragile ones. As for your opinions, I look forward to hearing them." A man would be a fool to marry someone with whom he could not have an interesting conversation. Clara felt warmth spreading through her chest, and she smiled back at him. "Then we understand each other." "I believe we do," Thomas said. "Now there is the matter of the wedding. I spoke with Reverend Harrison when I was in town last week, and he said he could perform the ceremony any time we are ready. I thought perhaps in a few days, to give you time to settle in and meet some of the neighbors. My sister lives on the neighboring ranch with her husband, and she has been eager to meet you. She mentioned that she would be happy to help you find a wedding dress, if you do not have one." Clara hesitated, feeling the old familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever she thought about the trappings of traditional femininity. "Mr. Garrett, I should tell you that I have no wedding dress, and I have no intention of acquiring one. If we are to be married, I would prefer to wear something practical and comfortable, not a gown that will trip me up and restrict my movement." She expected surprise, perhaps even disapproval, but Thomas simply nodded. "That seems reasonable. What did you have in mind?" "I thought perhaps my gray wool skirt and a clean white shirt," Clara said. "It is the nicest outfit I own, and it is what I feel most like myself in." Thomas considered this for a moment, then said, "Miss Bennett, this is your wedding as much as it is mine. You should wear whatever makes you happy. If you want to wear your wool skirt, then that is what you should wear. If you wanted to wear trousers, I would have no objection to that either. The ceremony is about the vows we make to each other, not about what we are wearing when we make them." Clara stared at him, feeling something shift inside her chest, something warm and unexpected. In all her years in Philadelphia, no man had ever told her to do what made her happy. Men had told her what to do, how to behave, what to wear, but never once had any of them suggested that her happiness mattered. "You truly mean that," she said, and it was not quite a question. "I do," Thomas said. "I want a partner, Miss Bennett, not an ornament. A marriage should be built on mutual respect and understanding, and I cannot respect someone if I am constantly trying to make them into something they are not. You are who you are, and that is exactly who I want to marry." Clara felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, and she blinked them back fiercely. She was not a woman who cried easily, but Thomas's simple acceptance was almost overwhelming. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You cannot know how much that means to me." "I think I might have some idea," Thomas said gently. "Now, shall we finish our meal and head out to the ranch? I am eager to show you your new home." They finished eating in companionable silence, and then Thomas paid the bill and led Clara back out to the wagon. The ride out of town took them through rolling grasslands dotted with cattle, and Clara breathed in the clean air, feeling more alive than she had in years. The ranch house came into view after about an hour, a sturdy wooden structure with a wide porch and a barn nearby. It was not grand, but it was well built and clearly maintained with care. Thomas helped Clara down from the wagon and carried her trunk inside. The interior was simple but comfortable, with a main room that served as both kitchen and living area, a bedroom off to one side, and a loft above that Thomas explained he had been using for storage, but could easily be converted into another bedroom. The furniture was handmade but solid, and there were curtains on the windows and a colorful rag rug on the floor that suggested a woman's touch. "My sister Sarah made the curtains and the rug," Thomas explained, seeing Clara's gaze. "She has been trying to make the place more homelike, though I fear I have not been the most attentive housekeeper." "It is lovely," Clara said, and she meant it. The house had a warmth to it, a sense of being lived in and cared for. "Where should I put my things?" "The bedroom is yours," Thomas said. "I will sleep in the loft until after the wedding if that is agreeable to you. I want you to feel comfortable here." Clara nodded, grateful for his consideration. She carried her trunk into the bedroom, which contained a large bed with a patchwork quilt, a dresser, and a washstand. It was more space than she had ever had to herself, and she felt a surge of excitement at the thought of making it her own. Over the next few days, Clara settled into life on the ranch. Thomas was up before dawn every morning to tend to the cattle and horses, and Clara quickly established her own routine. She cooked breakfast while Thomas did the morning chores, and then she spent the day exploring the property, learning where everything was kept, and helping with whatever tasks needed doing. She discovered that she enjoyed the physical work, the sense of accomplishment that came from hauling water or feeding the chickens or hanging laundry to dry in the wind. Thomas's sister Sarah came to visit on the second day, riding over from the neighboring ranch with her husband Jack. Sarah was a plump, cheerful woman with the same dark hair and gray eyes as her brother, and she greeted Clara with genuine warmth. "I am so glad Thomas finally found someone," Sarah said, hugging Clara as though they were old friends. "He has been alone for too long, and this ranch needs a woman's presence." "I am happy to be here," Clara said, and realized that it was true. In just a few days, she had felt more at home in Wyoming than she ever had in Philadelphia. Sarah had brought fabric and offered to help Clara sew a wedding dress, but Clara politely declined, explaining her preference for practical clothing. Sarah looked surprised for a moment, then laughed. "Well, that is certainly different, but if it is what you want, then I support you. Thomas told me that you have a mind of your own, and I think that is exactly what he needs. My brother is a good man, but he can be too serious sometimes. You will be good for him." The wedding was scheduled for the following Sunday to be held at the small church in Redemption. On Saturday, Clara washed and pressed her gray wool skirt and white cotton shirt, and Sarah came over to help her arrange her hair. Clara had insisted on keeping it simple, just brushed out and pinned back with a few wildflowers that Sarah had picked from the meadow near her ranch. "You look beautiful," Sarah said, stepping back to admire her work. "Truly, Clara, you have a natural loveliness that does not need any artifice." Clara looked at herself in the small mirror above the dresser and saw a woman who looked healthy and strong, with color in her cheeks and a brightness in her green eyes. She did not look like the pale, corseted ladies of Philadelphia, and she was glad of it. On Sunday morning, Thomas drove Clara into town in the wagon, both of them dressed in their best. Thomas wore a black suit that he admitted he had purchased specially for the occasion, and he looked handsome and slightly uncomfortable in the formal clothing. Clara wore her gray skirt and white shirt, and she carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that Sarah had made for her. When they arrived at the church, a small crowd had already gathered. Sarah and Jack were there, along with several of Thomas's ranch hands and a number of townspeople who Clara did not yet know. Reverend Harrison was a tall, thin man with kind eyes, and he greeted them warmly at the door. "Are you ready?" Thomas asked Clara quietly, offering her his arm. "I am," Clara said, taking his arm and feeling the solid strength of him beside her. They walked into the church together, and Clara was aware of the curious glances directed at her clothing, but she kept her head high and her gaze forward. She had made her choice, and she would not apologize for it. The ceremony was simple and brief. Reverend Harrison spoke about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of partnership and mutual respect, and then he asked Thomas and Clara to exchange their vows. Thomas's voice was steady as he promised to love and honor Clara, to be her partner in all things, and to respect her as an equal. When it was Clara's turn, she spoke from the heart, promising to stand beside Thomas, to build a life with him, to share in both the joys and the hardships that lay ahead. When Reverend Harrison pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas leaned down and kissed Clara gently, and she felt a warmth spreading through her entire body. This was real. This was the beginning of something new. After the ceremony, Sarah had arranged a small reception at the hotel, with food and cake and even a fiddler to provide music. Clara found herself surrounded by well-wishers, people introducing themselves and welcoming her to redemption. She met ranchers and shopkeepers, the town doctor and the schoolteacher, and all of them seemed genuinely pleased to have her there. One older woman, Mrs. Henderson, approached Clara with a curious expression. "I must say, Mrs. Garrett, I was surprised by your choice of attire for the wedding. It is quite unconventional." Clara braced herself for criticism, but before she could respond, Thomas appeared at her side, slipping his arm around her waist. "My wife wore exactly what she wanted to wear," he said calmly, "and I think she looked perfect." Clara does not follow convention for the sake of it, and that is one of the many things I admire about her. Mrs. Henderson blinked, then smiled. "Well, I suppose there is no harm in being a bit different. Welcome to redemption, Mrs. Garrett. I hope you will be very happy here." As the afternoon wore on, Clara danced with Thomas, with Jack, and with several of the other men, and she laughed more than she had in years. When the sun began to set, Thomas suggested they head back to the ranch, and Clara agreed, suddenly eager to begin their life together in earnest. The ride back was quiet, with the sky turning purple and gold above them and the first stars beginning to appear. When they reached the ranch, Thomas helped Clara down from the wagon and then stood looking at her in the fading light. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "that I will never ask you to be anything other than who you are. Today, when you refused to wear a wedding dress, it showed me that you have the courage to stand by your convictions, even when it might be easier to simply go along with expectations. That is the kind of strength this land demands, and it is the kind of strength I need in a partner." Clara felt tears welling up again, and this time she let them fall. "I was so afraid," she admitted, "afraid that you would be disappointed, that you would want someone different. I have spent so much of my life trying to fit into a mold that was never meant for me, and I am so tired of pretending to be something I am not." Thomas reached out and gently wiped the tears from her cheeks. "You never have to pretend with me, Clara. I want the real you, with all your opinions and your independence and your refusal to wear a corset." He smiled at that, and Clara laughed through her tears. "I think I am going to be very happy here," she said. "I will do everything in my power to make sure of it," Thomas promised. They went inside together, and Thomas lit the lamps while Clara put on water for tea. It felt natural and comfortable, working side by side, and Clara realized that this was what she had been searching for all along. Not romance in the grand, dramatic sense, but partnership, companionship, a life built on mutual respect and understanding. That night, lying in Thomas's arms in the big bed, Clara felt truly at peace for the first time in her life. The wind whispered through the prairie grass outside, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called, and Clara thought that she had finally come home. The weeks that followed were a time of learning and adjustment. Clara threw herself into the work of the ranch with enthusiasm, discovering that she had a natural aptitude for handling the horses and a good eye for spotting when a cow was about to give birth. Thomas taught her how to rope a calf, how to mend fences, how to read the weather in the shape of the clouds. In return, Clara organized the household with an efficiency that Thomas admitted he had never managed on his own, and she proved to be an excellent cook, having learned from her mother years ago. They fell into an easy rhythm together, rising early and working hard through the day, then spending the evenings talking by the fire or sitting on the porch and watching the stars come out. Thomas told Clara about his childhood in Missouri, about how he and Sarah had come west after their parents died, determined to make a new start. Clara told him about Philadelphia, about the stifling expectations and the feeling of being trapped in a life that did not fit her. "I used to dream about wide open spaces," she said one evening, sitting beside Thomas on the porch steps. "About places where I could breathe without feeling like the walls were closing in. And now here I am, and it is everything I hoped it would be." Thomas took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I am glad you came, Clara. I did not realize how lonely I was until you arrived and filled this house with life." As summer gave way to fall, Clara proved herself to be invaluable during the cattle drive to the railroad in Cheyenne. She insisted on going along despite Thomas's initial hesitation, and she spent 2 weeks in the saddle, helping to keep the herd moving and cooking for the ranch hands over an open fire. The men were skeptical at first, unused to working alongside a woman, but Clara's competence and good humor won them over quickly. By the time they reached Cheyenne and sold the cattle for a good price, the ranch hands were singing her praises. "Your wife is something special, boss," said Jake, the head wrangler, as they prepared to head back to the ranch. "I have never seen a woman work as hard as she does." "I know," Thomas said, looking over at Clara, who was checking the cinch on her saddle. "I am a lucky man." The sale of the cattle brought in enough money to see them through the winter, with some left over for improvements to the ranch. Thomas wanted to build an additional barn and repair the roof on the main house, and Clara suggested they also invest in some breeding stock to improve the quality of their herd. Thomas listened to her ideas with genuine interest, and they planned out the coming year together, partners in every sense of the word. Winter in Wyoming was harsh, with snow piling up to the windowsills and temperatures dropping so low that water froze in the bucket overnight. Clara and Thomas spent long hours huddled by the fire, reading aloud to each other from the few books they owned and playing cards to pass the time. Clara taught Thomas how to play whist, and he taught her a complicated game involving dice that he had learned from a gambler in Cheyenne years ago. It was during one of those long winter evenings that Clara realized she was pregnant. She had missed her monthly courses for 2 months running, and there was a tenderness in her breasts and a queasiness in the mornings that she recognized from helping her aunt nurse a cousin through a pregnancy years ago. She told Thomas one night as they were getting ready for bed, and he stared at her for a long moment before breaking into the widest smile she had ever seen on his face. "Truly?" he asked, pulling her into his arms. "We are going to have a child." "Yes," Clara said, laughing at his excitement. "Sometime in the late spring, I think." Thomas kissed her with such tenderness that Clara felt her heart might burst. "This is the best news I could have imagined," he said. "Our family is growing." Sarah was equally thrilled when they told her, and she immediately began knitting baby clothes and offering advice. Clara weathered the early months of pregnancy with determination, refusing to let the nausea and fatigue slow her down more than necessary. She still helped with the morning chores and cooked the meals, though Thomas insisted on taking over the heavier tasks. "You need to rest," he said when she protested. "You are carrying our child, and that is work enough." "I am pregnant, not ill," Clara retorted, but she appreciated his concern nonetheless. As winter thawed into spring, Clara's belly began to swell, and she found herself having to adjust her clothing to accommodate her changing shape. She refused to wear the traditional maternity gowns that Sarah offered, instead altering her skirts to fit and wearing Thomas's old shirts when her own no longer buttoned. Thomas thought she looked beautiful, and he told her so often enough that Clara actually started to believe him. The baby arrived on a warm day in May, after a labor that lasted nearly 20 hours. Sarah was there to help, along with Mrs. Henderson, who turned out to be an experienced midwife despite her initial disapproval of Clara's unconventional ways. Thomas paced outside the bedroom for most of the labor, until Sarah finally took pity on him and let him come in to hold Clara's hand during the final stages. "I am here," he murmured, wiping the sweat from her forehead. "You are doing wonderfully, Clara, so strong, so brave." When the baby finally emerged, red-faced and wailing, Mrs. Henderson announced that it was a boy, healthy and perfect. Thomas cut the cord with shaking hands, and then the baby was placed in Clara's arms, and she looked down at the tiny, wrinkled face and felt a love so fierce it took her breath away. "He is beautiful," she whispered. "He looks like you," Thomas said, touching the baby's downy head with one finger. "He has your nose and your chin." They named him Samuel, after Thomas's father, and he proved to be a robust, happy baby who rarely fussed. Clara took to motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything else, learning how to nurse and change diapers and soothe a crying infant with a competence that surprised her. Thomas was a devoted father, walking the floor with Samuel in the evenings when he was fussy and singing old ballads in a surprisingly good baritone voice. As Samuel grew from an infant into a chubby, curious toddler, Clara found that she could manage both motherhood and the work of the ranch. She carried Samuel in a sling on her back while she fed the chickens or tended the garden, and he learned to crawl and then walk while playing in the dirt near the barn while his parents worked. It was not the life Clara had been raised to expect, but it was the life she had chosen, and she would not have traded it for anything. When Samuel was 2 years old, Clara discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and she gave birth to a daughter in the early spring of 1881. They named her Rose after Thomas's mother, and she had Clara's copper hair and Thomas's gray eyes. Sarah declared her the most beautiful baby she had ever seen, and even the gruff ranch hands went soft when they saw her tiny face peeking out from her blankets. Life on the ranch settled into a pattern of hard work and deep contentment. Clara and Thomas built their herd slowly but steadily, earning a reputation for quality cattle and fair dealing. Samuel grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved the horses and followed his father everywhere, and Rose proved to be equally adventurous, learning to ride almost before she could walk properly. One day, when Samuel was 5 and Rose was 3, Clara was working in the garden when a wagon pulled up to the house. She shaded her eyes against the sun and saw a well-dressed woman climbing down, followed by a man in a fine suit. It took Clara a moment to recognize her aunt from Philadelphia, and her heart sank. "Aunt Margaret," Clara said, wiping her dirty hands on her apron. "This is unexpected." "Clara," her aunt said, looking around at the ranch with obvious distaste, "I have come to see how you are living. I received your letters, but I could not quite believe the descriptions. And now, seeing you in this wilderness, dressed like a common laborer, I understand why you were so vague." The man with her aunt introduced himself as Mr. Pemberton, a lawyer. "Your aunt has asked me to come along to discuss certain matters regarding your inheritance," he said. "There is the question of your parents' estate, which has been held in trust." Clara felt a flutter of anxiety. She had not thought about her parents' money in years, having assumed that her aunt had control of it. "I did not know there was an inheritance," she said carefully. "There is a considerable sum," Mr. Pemberton said. "Your parents were quite well off, and the estate has been managed carefully in your absence. Now that you are married and settled, it is time to transfer the funds to your control." Aunt Margaret sniffed, "though I question whether this is truly settled. Clara, you are living in a shack in the middle of nowhere, doing manual labor like a servant. This is not the life your parents would have wanted for you." Clara felt anger rising in her chest. "This is exactly the life I wanted for myself, Aunt Margaret. I am happy here. I have a husband who respects me, children who are healthy and thriving, and work that I find meaningful. I would not trade any of it for your society balls and empty conversations. But look at you," her aunt said, gesturing at Clara's practical skirt and worn boots. "You dress like a man. You have calluses on your hands. You are wasting your life. Before Clara could respond, Thomas appeared from the barn, with Samuel riding on his shoulders and Rose toddling along beside him holding his hand. He took in the scene quickly, his expression hardening as he looked at Aunt Margaret. "I am Thomas Garrett," he said, setting Samuel down and offering his hand to Mr. Pemberton. "Clara's husband. Is there a problem?" "No problem," Mr. Pemberton said quickly, shaking Thomas's hand. "I am simply here to discuss Mrs. Garrett's inheritance. There are papers to sign." Aunt Margaret, however, was not finished. "Mr. Garrett, I must speak plainly. My niece has thrown away every advantage she was born with to live in this God-forsaken place. I came here hoping to convince her to return to Philadelphia with me, where she can live as a lady should, but I see that she has been completely corrupted by this rough life." Thomas's expression went cold. "Ma'am, I think you should leave. Clara is my wife, and she is exactly where she wants to be. If you cannot respect her choices, then you are not welcome here." "How dare you speak to me that way?" Aunt Margaret sputtered. "I am her family." "And I am her husband," Thomas said firmly. "Clara, do you want your aunt to stay?" Clara looked at her aunt, at the disdain and disapproval written on her face, and felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. "No," she said clearly. "Aunt Margaret, you never understood me, not even when I was living in your house. You tried to make me into something I was not, and when I refused to conform, you made my life miserable. I came to Wyoming to escape that life, and I have found happiness here beyond anything I ever imagined. I will sign whatever papers Mr. Pemberton needs me to sign, and then I would appreciate it if you would leave and not come back." Her aunt's face turned red. "You will regret this, Clara, mark my words." "The only thing I regret," Clara said, "is that I did not leave sooner, Mr. Pemberton looked deeply uncomfortable, but he pulled out the necessary papers, and Clara signed them at the kitchen table while Thomas stood beside her with a supportive hand on her shoulder. The amount of money was indeed substantial, more than Clara had imagined, and she and Thomas exchanged a look of surprise and excitement. When the papers were signed, Mr. Pemberton tipped his hat politely and escorted Aunt Margaret back to the wagon. Clara watched them drive away, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Are you all right?" Thomas asked, pulling her into his arms. "I am perfect," Clara said, leaning into his embrace. "I have everything I need right here." The inheritance money allowed them to make significant improvements to the ranch. They built a larger house with proper bedrooms for the children and a big kitchen where Clara could cook without feeling cramped. They hired additional ranch hands and expanded their herd. They even purchased a fine stallion to improve their horse breeding program, something Thomas had been dreaming about for years. But despite their increased prosperity, Clara and Thomas never lost sight of what was truly important. They worked side by side every day, teaching their children the value of hard work and the importance of treating people with respect. Clara continued to wear practical clothing and to speak her mind, and Thomas continued to support her unconditionally. Samuel grew into a tall, serious boy who loved the cattle as much as his father did, and Rose became a skilled horsewoman who could outride most of the ranch hands by the time she was 10. In 1885, Clara gave birth to twin boys, Henry and James, who were as mischievous as they were charming. The house was always full of noise and laughter, and Clara often thought back to her lonely days in Philadelphia and marveled at how much her life had changed. One evening, when the children were in bed and Clara and Thomas were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, Thomas said, "Do you ever regret it, leaving Philadelphia, coming out here to marry a stranger?" Clara looked at him, at the man who had accepted her exactly as she was from the very beginning, who had told her to wear whatever made her happy and had meant it, who had built a life with her based on partnership and mutual respect. "Not for a single moment," she said. "This is where I was always meant to be." Thomas took her hand and kissed it gently. "I am glad you refused to wear that wedding dress," he said. "It was the first sign that you were brave enough to be yourself, and that is the woman I fell in love with." "I love you," Clara said, and the words felt as true and solid as the ground beneath her feet. "I love you too," Thomas said. "Always." The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and challenges. There were droughts that tested their resolve and harsh winters that took a toll on the livestock. There were illnesses and injuries, close calls and narrow escapes. But through it all, Clara and Thomas faced everything together, their bond growing stronger with each passing year. Samuel took over more of the ranch operations as he grew older, showing a natural talent for business and breeding cattle. Rose married a neighboring rancher's son when she was 20, a kind young man named Daniel who respected her independence and loved her fierce spirit. Henry and James became expert horsemen, training animals that were sought after throughout the territory. In 1889, Wyoming became a state, and Clara was thrilled when women were granted the right to vote. She and Thomas rode into town together on election day, and Clara cast her ballot with pride, thinking about how far she had come from the restricted life she had known in Philadelphia. As they grew older, Clara's hair turned from copper to silver, and lines appeared around Thomas's eyes and mouth, but they still worked the ranch together every day, still sat on the porch in the evenings talking about their lives and their dreams. Their love had deepened over the years, becoming something rich and complex, built on shared experiences and unwavering support. When their first grandchild was born, a daughter of Samuel's whom they named Clara after her grandmother, Clara held the tiny baby in her arms and felt the circle of life completing itself. She looked at Thomas, who was watching her with such tenderness that it made her heart ache, and she thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Do you remember the day we met?" she asked him. "Every detail," Thomas said. "You stepped off that stage wearing trousers and looking like you were ready to take on the world." "I was terrified," Clara admitted. "Terrified that you would reject me, that I would have to go back to Philadelphia and live the rest of my life in a cage." "I knew the moment I saw you that you were exactly who I needed," Thomas said. "You were brave and strong and true to yourself, and those are the qualities that built this ranch and raised our children and made our life together so rich." Clara felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "You gave me freedom," she said. "The freedom to be myself, to wear what I wanted, to speak my mind, to build the life I had always dreamed of. You gave me that gift on the day you told me to wear whatever made me happy, and you have given it to me every day since." Thomas wiped away her tears with his weathered thumbs. "You gave me a life filled with love and laughter and purpose. You gave me children who are strong and capable and kind. You gave me a partner who challenges me and supports me and never lets me settle for less than I can be. We built this together, Clara, every bit of it." They sat together on the porch as the sun set over the prairie, watching the sky turn gold and purple and finally deep blue. Inside the house, their family was gathered, children and grandchildren filling every corner with noise and warmth. Clara leaned her head against Thomas's shoulder and felt his arm come around her, solid and sure. "I would do it all again," she said softly. "Every moment, every choice, every challenge, I would choose you 1,000 times over." "As would I," Thomas said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "As would I." The stars began to appear overhead, the same stars that had guided Clara on her journey from Philadelphia all those years ago. She had left behind a life of restriction and expectation, had taken a leap of faith into the unknown, and had found everything she had been searching for. She had found home, she had found purpose, she had found love, and it had all begun with a simple act of courage, a refusal to conform, and a cowboy who had looked at her and said the words that changed everything. "Wear whatever makes you happy." As the years continued to flow like a gentle river, Clara and Thomas celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary in the summer of 1908. Their children organized a party at the ranch, inviting neighbors from miles around. The house that Clara and Thomas had built with the inheritance money had been added onto several times over the years, growing to accommodate family gatherings and the occasional ranch hand who needed a place to stay during the busy seasons. The celebration was a joyous affair, with tables laden with food set up in the yard and a band playing fiddle music for dancing. Clara watched her grandchildren running through the grass, their laughter carrying on the wind, and felt a profound sense of gratitude for the life she had built. There were 8 grandchildren now, with another on the way, and each one of them was being raised with the same values that Clara and Thomas had instilled in their own children: hard work, honesty, and the courage to be true to oneself. Rose stood beside her mother, watching her own children play. She was expecting her 4th child, and she looked radiantly happy despite the Wyoming heat. "Mother," she said, "I have been thinking about the stories you have told me about coming here, about refusing to wear a wedding dress and how Father supported you. I want you to know how much those stories have meant to me. When Daniel and I were courting and he made some comment about how I should be more ladylike, I told him that if he could not accept me as I was, he could look elsewhere for a wife. He changed his tune quickly enough." Clara laughed, squeezing her daughter's hand. "I am glad you learned that lesson earlier than I did. It took me too many years to understand that I did not have to change myself to be worthy of love. You and Father showed me what a real partnership looks like," Rose said. "You worked together, supported each other, respected each other. That is what I wanted in my own marriage, and that is what I found." Thomas joined them, looking distinguished with his silver hair and weathered face. He had slowed down some in recent years, his joints stiff from decades of hard work, but he was still strong and vital. "Are you two talking about me?" he asked with a teasing smile. "Always," Clara said, reaching up to kiss his cheek. "Rose was just telling me how our marriage set an example for her." "Well, that is all you're doing," Thomas said, putting his arm around Clara's waist. "You were the one who taught our children to stand up for themselves and to never settle for less than they deserved." "We did that together," Clara corrected him. "Everything we have accomplished has been together." Samuel approached with his wife Anna and their 3 children. Samuel had grown into a man who looked remarkably like his father, with the same gray eyes and strong jaw. He had taken over most of the day-to-day operations of the ranch several years ago, allowing Thomas to step back and enjoy his grandchildren, though Thomas still consulted on major decisions and helped out during the busy seasons. "Father, Mother," Samuel said, "Anna and I wanted to give you your anniversary present now, before things get too chaotic." He handed them a wrapped package, and Clara carefully removed the paper to reveal a framed photograph of their entire family, taken just that morning. Everyone was there: children, grandchildren, sons-in-law and daughters-in-law, all gathered together on the porch of the ranch house. Clara felt tears welling up as she looked at the photograph. "This is perfect," she said. "Thank you, Samuel." "We wanted you to have something to remember this day," Anna said warmly. She was a sweet woman from town who had fallen in love with Samuel's quiet strength and dedication to the ranch. "You and Thomas have built something truly remarkable here, not just a successful ranch, but a loving family." The afternoon passed in a blur of food and music and laughter. Clara danced with Thomas, with her sons-in-law, and even with her oldest grandson, who was now 14 and already nearly as tall as his father. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, everyone gathered around to hear Thomas and Clara speak. Thomas cleared his throat, looking slightly uncomfortable with being the center of attention, but he took Clara's hand and faced their family. "30 years ago," he said, "I was a lonely rancher who placed an advertisement for a mail-order bride, hoping to find someone who could share this life with me. What I got was so much more than I ever expected." Clara came to Wyoming with courage and determination, refusing to conform to expectations, and she transformed not just this ranch but my entire life. She showed me what it means to be a true partner, to work side by side through good times and bad, to build something that lasts. He turned to Clara, his eyes shining with emotion. "You have given me 30 years of happiness, Clara. You have given me 4 beautiful children and 8 grandchildren so far. You have worked beside me every day, never complaining, always finding solutions to problems, always pushing forward. But most importantly, you have been yourself, completely and unapologetically, and that has been the greatest gift of all. You taught me that love is not about changing someone to fit an ideal, but about accepting them exactly as they are and supporting them in becoming the best version of themselves. Clara felt tears streaming down her cheeks, and she did not bother to wipe them away. "Thomas," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "when I got off that stage 30 years ago, I was running away from a life that was suffocating me. I did not know if I would find happiness in Wyoming, but I knew I had to try. And then I met you, and you told me to wear whatever made me happy on our wedding day, and in that moment, I knew that I had found something precious. You gave me freedom, respect, and love, and you have given me those things every single day since. We have built this life together, stone by stone, day by day, and I would not change a single moment of it." She looked around at their family, at the faces of their children and grandchildren, all watching with tears in their own eyes. "This is what we have created," she said. "Not just a ranch, not just a business, but a family built on love and respect and the courage to be true to ourselves. I hope that each of you will carry these values forward, that you will teach your own children to stand up for what they believe in and to never let anyone make them feel small or unworthy." The family erupted in applause, and Clara found herself surrounded by hugging, crying children and grandchildren. Thomas stood beside her, his arm around her waist, and she leaned into him, feeling the solid strength that had supported her for 3 decades. As the evening wore on and the guests began to depart, Clara and Thomas sat on the porch steps, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The sounds of the ranch were familiar and comforting, horses moving in the corral, the distant lowing of cattle, the wind whispering through the grass. "Do you remember our wedding night?" Thomas asked quietly. "When we came back here and I told you that you never had to pretend with me?" "I remember every word," Clara said. "I remember thinking that I had found something I had not even known I was looking for." "I felt the same way," Thomas said. "I had resigned myself to a life alone, thinking that no woman would want to share the hardships of ranching. And then you arrived, and you were so much stronger and braver than I had imagined. You made this house a home, Clara. You made my life complete." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Clara said, "I have been thinking about writing down our story, not for publication but for our grandchildren and their children. I want them to know how we met, how we built this life together, how we faced challenges and overcame them. I want them to understand that love is not always easy, but it is always worth fighting for." "That is a wonderful idea," Thomas said. "You should include the part about refusing to wear a wedding dress. That moment defined so much of who we became together." "It was the first time I truly tested your acceptance," Clara said. "I was so afraid you would withdraw your offer, that you would tell me I had to conform, but you did not. You told me to wear whatever made me happy, and you have been telling me that in one way or another ever since." "Because your happiness has always been important to me," Thomas said simply. "What kind of marriage would we have had if I had tried to force you into a mold that did not fit? You would have been miserable, and I would have been living with a stranger, not a partner. By accepting you as you were, I got the real Clara, and she is the woman I fell in love with." Clara turned to face him, taking both of his hands in hers. "I want you to know that you saved me, Thomas, not in some romantic, dramatic way, but in a real, lasting way. You saved me from a life of pretending, of slowly suffocating under the weight of expectations I could never meet. You gave me room to breathe, to grow, to become fully myself. And in doing that, you gave me the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." Thomas pulled her close, and they sat together under the stars, 2 people who had chosen each other across the miles and the years, who had built a life of meaning and purpose and love. The ranch around them was a testament to their hard work and dedication, but the true legacy was the family they had raised, children and grandchildren who were growing up with the understanding that love meant acceptance. That strength meant standing up for your convictions, and that happiness came from being true to yourself. The seasons continued to change, bringing the cycle of birth and death, of planting and harvest, of hard work and well-earned rest. Clara and Thomas grew older together, their bodies slowing down but their spirits remaining vibrant. They watched their grandchildren grow and begin to have children of their own, creating a new generation of the Garrett family. Clara did write down their story, filling page after page with memories and reflections. She wrote about the day she arrived in redemption, about Thomas's acceptance of her unconventional ways, about the challenges they had faced and overcome together. She wrote about the births of their children, about drought and blizzards and financial struggles, about triumphs and losses and the everyday moments that had made up their life together. And she wrote about love, real and lasting love, the kind that was built not on passion alone but on respect and partnership and unwavering support. When she finished the manuscript, she gave it to Rose to keep safe, asking her to share it with the grandchildren when they were old enough to understand. Rose read it with tears streaming down her face, and then she hugged her mother tightly. "This is beautiful, Mother. This is a legacy that will last for generations." On a crisp autumn day in 1912, Clara and Thomas celebrated their 54th anniversary. Thomas was 84 years old, and Clara was 76. They had both slowed down considerably, spending most of their days on the porch in rocking chairs, watching the ranch operations from a distance. Samuel ran everything now with help from Henry and James, and Rose's oldest son had come to work on the ranch as well, learning the trade from his uncles. The family gathered again, though it was a smaller celebration this time, just a dinner with their children and the grandchildren who lived nearby. Clara looked around the table at the faces she loved most in the world and felt a deep sense of peace. She had lived a long, full life, and she had no regrets. After dinner, Thomas asked Clara to walk with him, and despite their age and the increasing frailty of their bodies, they made their way slowly out to the pasture behind the house. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the grass, and the air was cool and sweet. "Do you remember when we used to ride out here on horseback?" Thomas asked, his voice thin but steady. "I remember everything," Clara said, leaning on his arm for support. "I remember every ride, every conversation, every moment we have shared." They stood together, looking out over the land they had worked for more than half a century. In the distance, cattle grazed peacefully and horses ran in the corral. The house behind them was full of family, full of love and life and laughter. "I could not have asked for a better life," Thomas said quietly, "or a better partner to share it with." "Nor could I," Clara said. "We did well, Thomas. We built something that will last long after we are gone." "Because of you," Thomas said. "Because you had the courage to be yourself, even when it would have been easier to conform. That courage inspired me, inspired our children, and it will inspire generations to come." Clara rested her head against his shoulder, feeling the familiar comfort of his presence. They stood there as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant colors, and Clara thought that there could be no more perfect moment than this, standing beside the man she loved, surrounded by the life they had built together, knowing that their love would endure through their children and grandchildren and beyond. Thomas passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 years later, in the winter of 1914. Clara held his hand as he took his last breath, and though her heart broke at the loss, she was grateful that he had not suffered, that he had lived a long and meaningful life, that he had been surrounded by love until the very end. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, ranchers and townspeople and business associates from across the state. Everyone who spoke remembered Thomas as a fair and honest man, a hard worker, and a devoted family man. But it was Clara's words that moved people to tears. "My husband gave me the greatest gift anyone can give," she said, standing beside his grave. "He gave me the freedom to be myself. From the very beginning, he accepted me exactly as I was, and he supported me in becoming the person I was meant to be." Our marriage was built on respect and partnership, and it lasted for more than 54 years. I will miss him every day for the rest of my life, but I am grateful for every moment we had together, and I know that the love we shared will live on through our children and grandchildren and all the generations that follow. Clara lived for another 6 years, remaining active and engaged despite her grief. She spent her days with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, telling them stories about the old days and making sure they understood the values that had built the Garrett legacy. She continued to wear practical clothing and to speak her mind, and she never lost the fierce independence that had defined her from the beginning. On a warm spring morning in 1920, Clara passed away in her sleep, with Rose sitting beside her bed. She was 84 years old, and she had lived to see Wyoming transformed from a wild territory into a modern state. Her obituary in the Redemption newspaper described her as a pioneer, a rancher, a devoted wife and mother, and a woman ahead of her time. But the real measure of Clara's life was not in newspaper obituaries or public recognition. It was in the family she had raised, in the values she had instilled, in the example she had set. Her grandchildren grew up telling their own children about the grandmother who had refused to wear a wedding dress, who had worn trousers when it was scandalous to do so, who had worked beside her husband as an equal partner, and who had taught them all that the most important thing in life was to be true to yourself. The ranch continued to thrive under Samuel's management, and then under his children. The Garrett name became synonymous with quality cattle and fair dealing throughout Wyoming. But more than that, it became synonymous with integrity, with courage, with the kind of love that accepts people exactly as they are. Rose kept Clara's manuscript safe, and when her own grandchildren were old enough, she read it to them, just as Clara had requested. The children sat wide-eyed as they heard about their great-grandmother's journey from Philadelphia, about the cowboy who had told her to wear whatever made her happy, about the life they had built together on the Wyoming prairie. Was she really that brave? One of the children asked. She was, Rose said. And so was your great-grandfather for accepting her as she was. They showed us all what real love looks like, not the kind you read about in fairy tales, but the kind that is built day by day through respect and support and unwavering commitment. The story of Clara and Thomas Garrett became a family legend, passed down through generations. Their great-great-grandchildren, living in a world that Clara could never have imagined, still told the story of the mail-order bride who refused to wear a wedding dress and the cowboy who loved her exactly as she was. And in that way, their love did become eternal, living on not just in memory but in the values and principles that continued to guide the family they had created. They had shown that true love is not about changing someone to fit your expectations, but about accepting them completely and supporting them in becoming the best version of themselves. They had shown that courage comes in many forms, including the courage to be yourself in a world that demands conformity. And they had shown that a life built on mutual respect and partnership can withstand any challenge and create a legacy that lasts for generations. The ranch itself remained in the family for more than a century, a testament to the hard work and dedication of Clara and Thomas. The house they had built was preserved and eventually turned into a family museum, with Clara's manuscript displayed prominently along with photographs and artifacts from their life together. Visitors came from across the country to learn about the pioneering spirit of the early Wyoming settlers, but they also came to hear the love story, the tale of two people who had found each other across the miles and built something beautiful together. On the wall of the museum, in Clara's own handwriting, were the words that had defined their marriage: "Wear whatever makes you happy." Below it was a photograph of Clara and Thomas on their wedding day, Clara in her gray wool skirt and white shirt, Thomas in his black suit, both of them smiling as though they had discovered a secret that the rest of the world had yet to learn. And perhaps they had. Perhaps the secret was simply this: That love, real and lasting love, is built not on grand gestures or passionate declarations, but on the quiet, everyday acceptance of another person exactly as they are. It is built on the courage to be yourself and the generosity to allow others to be themselves. It is built on partnership and respect and the willingness to stand beside someone through all the joys and challenges that life brings. Clara and Thomas Garrett had understood this truth, and they had lived it every day of their lives together. They had created a love story that was not dramatic or flashy, but deep and true and enduring. And that love had rippled out through their children and grandchildren and all the generations that followed, touching countless lives and inspiring others to seek the same kind of authentic connection. Years turned into decades, and decades turned into a century, but the story remained. It was told at family gatherings and written about in local history books. It was the subject of school essays and romantic reminiscences. And always at the heart of the story was that simple moment when a mail-order bride had refused to wear a wedding dress and a cowboy had said, "Wear whatever makes you happy." Those words had changed everything. They had opened the door to a life of freedom and authenticity and deep, abiding love. They had created a family legacy that valued courage and independence and mutual respect. And they had proven that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply to be yourself and to find someone who loves you for exactly who you are. In the end, that was the real story, not of a wedding dress refused, but of a love accepted, nurtured, and cherished across more than 5 decades. It was a story of 2 people who had chosen each other, and then had chosen each other again every single day, through work and hardship and joy and sorrow. It was a story of building a life together, stone by stone and day by day, until they had created something that would outlast them both. And it was a story that would never truly end, because love like theirs does not die. It transforms and evolves and continues on through the lives it has touched and the values it has instilled. Clara and Thomas Garrett's love story became part of the fabric of their family, woven into the very identity of everyone who came after them. Their great-great-great-grandchildren, living in the 21st century, would still point to them as an example of what marriage should be. They would still tell the story of Clara's courage and Thomas's acceptance. They would still understand that the foundation of their family was built on the simple but profound principle that people should be allowed to be themselves. That love means acceptance, and that happiness comes from authenticity. The Wyoming prairie where Clara and Thomas had worked and lived and loved continued on, timeless and beautiful. The wind still whispered through the grass, the stars still shone in the vast night sky, and somewhere in the distance, cattle still grazed on the rolling hills. The ranch had changed over the years, adapting to new technologies and modern methods, but the spirit of it remained the same, the spirit of hard work, integrity, and deep respect for the land and for each other. And if you stood very quietly on the porch of the old ranch house at sunset, when the light turned gold and the shadows grew long, you might almost imagine you could see them there. A woman in practical clothing and a man in dusty work clothes, sitting side by side in rocking chairs, their hands clasped together, their faces turned toward each other with expressions of complete contentment and love. You might almost hear the echo of their voices, talking about the day's work or the children, or simply enjoying the comfortable silence that comes when 2 people know each other so well that words are not always necessary. This was their legacy, not just the physical ranch or the financial success, or even the large family they had created, but this sense of peace and partnership and enduring love. They had shown that it was possible to build a life based on mutual respect and authentic self-expression. They had proven that true love does not require changing who you are, but rather finding someone who celebrates you exactly as you are. And so the story ended as all good stories must, but the love continued on, eternal and unchanging, a beacon for all who came after. Clara and Thomas Garrett had lived their lives with courage and integrity and deep devotion to each other. And in doing so, they had created something that would never fade. A love story for the ages, beginning with a simple refusal and a cowboy's even simpler response, and growing into a lifetime of happiness and fulfillment and perfect partnership. The sun set over the Wyoming prairie, painting the sky in brilliant colors one last time, and the wind carried with it the whispers of a love that had transcended time and circumstance, a love that had begun with acceptance and grown into something beautiful and lasting and true. And in that twilight moment, it seemed that everything Clara and Thomas had ever wanted, everything they had ever dreamed of, had come to pass. They had found each other, they had built a life together, and they had created a legacy that would endure forever. This was their story, a story of courage and acceptance, of hard work and dedication, of challenges overcome and joys celebrated, but most of all, a story of love. Real, deep, enduring love. The kind of love that changes the world, one heart at a time, one generation at a time, until it becomes part of the very fabric of history itself. And it all began with a mail-order bride who refused to wear a wedding dress and a cowboy who said, "Wear whatever makes you happy."